Good afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss Gandhi's work, Hindi Swaraj. This is the text which helps us to understand India as a nation in the political imagination. So we will kind of understand the context in which the Hindi Swaraj was written. The objective of Gandhi was twofold. One, to kind of critique Western civilization, and two, to ensure a path or a social structure which would be based on equality and inclusiveness. So then in this part of the lecture, we are going to look into a text which was written in 1909 and go a review of the chapter. So it has 20 chapters and each of these chapters are written in a dialogue form between the reader and the editor. The reader raises certain questions, certain concern to which Gandhi as an editor is responding. He is kind of critiquing certain set of ideas which were presented by a certain school of thought which were of kind of supportive of British civilization as superior, and articulated the idea of moving towards Western culture and norm. Gandhi is kind of giving us a notion that Indian civilization as religious and spiritual civilization is not inferior to Western civilization. So now let us look into each of the chapters and try to understand a text like Hindi Swaraj. Hindi Swaraj or Indian Home Rule was written by Gandhi to attempt to counter the growing school of violence. There was kind of unrest among the people and they wanted to kind of get rid of British rule through armed or through brutal forces. Gandhi hoped that the message of Hindi Swaraj would be enthroned in the hearts of the people and people would move away from rebellion, violence to a more peaceful and more non-violent method. He sincerely hoped that the doctrine of love preached in this booklet would take the place of brute force and guide the nationalist movement, especially those leaders who were ready to follow any method to win or to get Swaraj. So when we look into the first chapter is titled The Congress and its Official. So there was a lot of kind of mindset, or there were a lot of myths about the Congress becoming very subservient and becoming almost like subordinate to the Britishers and accepting the goals and demands of it. So in response to this, Gandhi kind of clarifies the role of Congress in the nationalist movement, and he argues that the goal of a newspaper is to express popular feeling, arouse specific sentiment, and expose popular defect which has given rise to desire for self-rule. So here he is articulating the dominant role of media, of newspaper in the nationalist struggle, and how they should and could play a very dominant role in terms of creating a sentiment of India as a nation. The Indian National Congress has laid the foundation for home rule by bringing together geographically disparate Indians and encouraging the idea of nationality. This ability to speak about home rule only exists because of the groundwork done by the moderate the Congress leader. Just because the young have the desire to go further and faster with their resistance to English does not mean that the elders' groundwork should be disrespected. It is essential to future development. Here, if we kind of make a sense of these writings, Gandhi was kind of saying that the moderate had a longer history and had a kind of a longer stay or contribution to the nationalist struggle, and it was the extremist was kind of more young, they were kind of just merged, and the impatience or their anxiety would not kind of be something that could disown the work that had been done for so many years. So the elders, such as kind of the moderate Congress leaders like Gokhale, should be respected for their intention to serve India, but do not have to be followed in every respect. Deriving older institution of honor would slow or stunt the project of progress. So the idea is that we could learn from these earlier leaders, but need not necessarily take on all the suggestions or path laid out, because we need to kind of now be ready to not only achieve Hind Swaraj, but also be able to accept it and be able to kind of contain it. And therefore, new dimensions had to be explored. The second chapter talks about the partition of Bengal, which happened in 1905. And the editor, that is Gandhi, says that the real awakening of India took place with the partition of Bengal by Lord Curzon. So it is kind of a point of time or a period of time which actually points out to the agitated mind or to the impatience of India that no longer could continue under a foreign rule. So the demand for the abrogation of the partition is a tantamount to a demand for home rule. So it was not kind of only negating the idea that the partition should not take place, but on the larger account, it was signaling or giving a symbolic of the fact that India was ready for its independence. The partition taught India that petition must be backed by force and that they must be capable of suffering. The partition divided the Congress into two factions, the moderate and the extremist. The third chapter talks about discontent and unrest. Now, while this long decade of or long struggle of independence was taking place and this partition had already created a discontent in the mind of the people, and there was a fraction within the Congress, there was a lot of anxiety, a lot of concern about how independence would be taking place. And this chapter 3 looks into the reforms that would take place. According to Gandhi, every reform must be preceded by discontent, and that's kind of something which is kind of philosophical, that if you will not have discontent, if you're satisfied with the status quo of things that are the way they are, then you will not have the urge to bring about transformation. Reform is only possible when you can identify the something wrong in the system. There is something which is problematic in the system. So Gandhi emphasizes the civic unrest is symptom of the underlying problem. And what was the problem? The problem was the foreign rule or the British rule. And it was kind of not the problem, say, if there was kind of economic poverty, or there was kind of inequality, or there were kind of low income of the people, if there was illiteracy, unemployment. It was not because there was kind of something which was emerging from the internal structure per se, but it was because of the long ages of foreign rule or the British rule. And this unrest, the discontent of the people was suggestive that now there had to be a transformation, there had to be a overhaul of the system, and the Britishers had to kind of do away with. The unrest will only end when India are able to fully wake up or build the independent democracy they finally realize they ought to have. Nobody, although the reader previously voiced more extreme opinions and called for armed rebellion, he represents the moderate view by asking about popular unrest. So the whole idea was not only be able to get political victory, kind of get independence by formation of a nation. The larger problem in front of India as a nation was to be able to cope up or to kind of find solution to the problems of social economic problems of disparity, discontent, and economic inequality, and so on and so forth. Chapter 4 is the most important part of this entire book, which is titled as What is Swaraj? Now, when he's talking about Hind Swaraj, this idea was to actually first explain the meaning of Swaraj, and it was not only a political independence, or it was not only self-government, but it was self-rule. That is, it was not only kind of changing the government from a British government to an Indian government, but but the ability to kind of get independence for each and every individual. So when he tries to define the concept of Swaraj, he clearly indicates that during the British, kind of just driving out the Britishers is not the same as attaining Swaraj. So you can throw out the English and still remain an Englishman. What was required was that once the foreign rule exists, each and every individual in the country is independent. They are not under the dominance of, say, a particular group which forms the government. And that is therefore also talking about decentralization. That is also talking about how power should belong to the mass. Gandhi says that Swaraj can be attained if the people become free, which will eventually lead to India becoming free. Gandhi said, it is Swaraj when we learn to rule ourselves. So it was kind of not something, isn't in terms of kind of you will have independence and freedom at an individual level only when the social order is egalitarian and inclusive. Swaraj should be something that has to be experienced by everyone. According to Gandhi, Swaraj is basically home rule or self-rule. And that is democracy for people, for every people, rule by themselves, for themselves. The chapter 5 is the condition of England. In this chapter, he is basically trying to identify the problems that existed in England in a way to critique the Western civilization. And why was he critiquing the Western civilization? Because the idea that was prevalent or that was under circulation was that the British civilization or the Western civilization was superior, the culture was more superior, and therefore once India kind of gained independence from the British rule, it would have to adopt the culture of the West. And that is why he is kind of bringing out the problems or the demerits of the Western civilization. Gandhi argues that the condition of Europe is not worth copying. The mother of parliament is like a sterile woman. If India copies England, she will be ruined. So it is kind of pointing out to the already problematic conditions in England, and India, if it copies, the conditions would further aggravate. Chapter 5 is talking about the pitiable condition of England. And that is why is it in a bad condition? It is because of the modern civilization, under which the nations of Europe are becoming degraded and mined day by day. Gandhi critiqued the English government as corrupt, inconsistent and ineffective, and therefore not suitable for Indians to follow the English model of government. The English model of government rewarded politicians by helping them accumulate money and power. It is top down. Unlike the bottom up participatory democracy that Gandhi kind of visualized for India. While England might pretend to be a democracy, in Gandhi's view, the English government abused the English people almost like it does the Indian people. So there is already a hierarchy in England itself between the power holders and those who are at the bottom. And this is kind of also a dominance of those who have power and economy to kind of make those who are at the lower as their slaves. So that is what Gandhi did not want to happen in India. He wanted an egalitarian society where every individual power and independence was enjoyed till the bottom or those at the margin. In fact, he also explains why Gandhi does not blame ordinary English people for the outlandish crimes the government has committed in India. He knows that officials were acting for their own self-interest, not at the people's behest. This chapter 6 is civilization. One of the most interesting things about Hindi Swaraj is its cross-cultural comparison between modern Western civilization and the traditional Indian civilization. Gandhi realized that most educated Indians were totally kind of awed, or they were kind of completely impressed by the Western civilization, and they were kind of overtaken by the glamour and the power, and it was kind of, if it was put into a kind of simple word. The Indians looked into the West as something which was very superior and which was kind of something which was much far ahead of Indian civilization. Gandhi says it was false. It was kind of not a reality. It was only what was presented to Indians by the British rulers. How do we then go away from it? His concern was to reorient Indians to their own civilization. And he focused on self-destructiveness of modernity, on its immorality and greed. So he was critiquing Western civilization and modernity as based on the unethical ideas of self-destruction, greed, violent attitude towards humans, and therefore it was kind of pointing out to the demerits of Western civilization. Gandhi argued that modern civilization caters only to the body and totally ignores moral development. So when we talk about modernity and when we talk about development based on science and technology, we see that we are moving towards a materialistic society. We are not thinking about our inner self. We are only pleasing our external self by consuming by high rate of consumptions, which could be technology, mobiles, cars. But our inner self, our mind and our heart are kind of becoming unethical, inhuman. So that is the comparison that Gandhi is doing between Western civilization and Indian civilization. Western civilization, Gandhi thought, was more materialistic, whereas India was more spiritual. It was more kind of concerned about inner harmony. Europe in olden days was not at all different from India of today. Most people labored with their hands to till the soil, plant the crops and harvest the grain. All that modern development have done is to enable a few to amass a great deal of wealth, while the condition of the rest is worse than that of the beasts. So what was actually presented to the Indians was only a part of the Western civilization that was on the top, which was kind of looking great, but the negative side was never shown to the Indian. Chapter 7 is why was India lost? That is, how were Britishers successful and having a control over India? Gandhi writes, English have not taken India. We have given it to them. We must try to blame others, but scrutinize and correct our main weakness. The English wish to convert the whole world into a vast market for their goods. So the reason why India lost was because they did not have a faith in their own culture and civilization, and they were attracted by what was appearing more appeasing, and therefore they had to kind of give away. Chapter 7 is why was India lost? Conditions of India is ground down and not under the English heel, but under that of modern civilization. We are turning away from God. India's suffering is due to our turning away from the religious life and accepting modern civilization. So when we look into this chapter 7, we also try to understand the secularization debate, and much of this accounts of secularization comes in with the growth of modernity and scientific tempo, where people were moving away from religion and getting more close to science and technology. Chapter 9, he talks about the conditions of railways. And here he is kind of pointing out to a dominant role of a large number of professions, railway doctors, lawyers, and they have kind of help us to spread all sorts of evil, because while good requires a long time to travel, evil has wings. It was the British who perpetuated the myth of divided India before it took advent of India, which was once culturally united. The Hindus and the Muslims, India was one nation, and we know in history the divide and rule policy kind of fragmented the nation. Religion and nationality was synonymous. Hindus and Muslims were kind of treated as brothers, and that should kind of come back. Gandhi was kind of against the religious differences between the two community and strengthened the desire to come back and coexist as one nation. The lawyers are often immoral because their profession thrives on quarrel and dispute. The British also used law codes to strengthen the illegitimate rule. Doctors, likewise, the medical professional, has aided imperialism. Most diseases are caused by lack of discipline and by indulgence which is encouraged through medication. Modern medicines is cruel because it is kind of interferes with the normal functioning of human body. Doctor use the profession and not to help people but to make money. So he's talking about these professions like lawyers and doctors which became the new middle class, and this happened because of the growth of Western education, because of growth in science and technology, the development in medicine. So these are all kind of part of the larger project, the modernity, but it has not done good to human being because it has kind of constructed a divide between the doctor and the patient, where the doctor is not necessarily only curing the disease but also at the same time exploiting his own patient. And therefore, chapter 13 talks about what is true civilization. Gandhi writes that civilization is that mode of conduct which points out to the man the path of duty. In this sense, India has nothing to learn from anyone else. So see, Gandhi points back to the past, to the golden age, and kind of points out that we already have a whole literatures and text which has given us the path through which humanity can progress. So when we already have it with us, we need not look outside and learn something from outsiders. The chapter 14 is how can India become free. It is Swaraj when we learn to rule ourselves. Only by freeing ourselves we dream of freeing other. India's strength is unique. Instead of Europeanizing ourselves, we can Indianize the Britishers. This is what was articulated by Gandhi. Chapter 15, he is making a comparison between Italy and India in terms of armed war and terrorism, assassination, which he says is not suitable for India because India is a holy land, and by bringing armed rebellion and violence, it would make the country unholy. Talking about chapter 16, brute force, he points out that India aren't armed and so cannot fight war. The editor suggests that English officials and others are kind of provoking Indians into brute force, and that would kind of hamper, degenerate the Indian civilization, and that is why they are provoking it. Gandhi felt that it was suicidal. It would mean giving ruthless assassin control over the government. Chapter 17 is passive resistance. That is how we take on a path where we resist the foreign rule and yet do not do anything which is against humanity. So we take a path of passive resistance. And he is kind of saying that history is not as a world of war and world of kings, but it is the story of humanity. And we can continue to maintain the story of humanity by taking the passive resistance. Passive resistance is not a weapon of the weak, but it actually requires more courage than the use of brutal force. So this is the mindset that war and violence requires force. Gandhi on the other side, that you really need a strong mind and a strong spirit to contain yourself and not indulge in brutal force. He says that passive resistance is for everybody, for men, women, from people of the weaker section or powerful, strong, single joint, because you need to kind of organize yourself as a unity, as a civilization and culture, and resist the outsider. Chapter 18 was on education. And Gandhi says that education was not only kind of learning letters or reading books and text, but it was about building character. And he was against Western education because he said that the Western education was only making individuals enslaved by the nation. And they were kind of only giving you bookish knowledge and taking you away from your own language, religion, and ethical understanding of your society. And therefore, he was in for kind of more of vernacular study, more of learning your own vernacular language and doing a lot of religious education, cultural education, which would become a strong driving force against the Western. Chapter 19 is on machinery, which is the use of machines and the goods. So he is talking about capitalism, which is aligned with imperialism. And both capitalism and imperialism oppress the common man. So through a lot of machine-made products, we are kind of moving away from humanity. And that is why he said machinery is bad. We must keep this in mind and kind of give more significance to handwork, to handloom, to a cottage industry. So we come to the last chapter, which is conclusion. And here he talks about the idea of united India as one nation against the Britishers. So he says the moderate and the extremists should join together. English must be asked to stop exploiting India. They cannot rule us against our will. Indians, in order to be free, must reform and discipline themselves. We must do away with a lot of copying of the Western or the European civilization and kind of not become more professionals and lawyers and doctors, but become more knowledgeable of our own culture, of our own civilization. So European civilization must be resisted at every state, even through personal sacrifice and suffering. All must take to the handloom. Real home rule is rule of the self or self-control. And this is how the conclusion of the text Hindi Swaraj is. So when we read this text, it helps us to understand a lot about the way in which India as a nation, India as a political nation, India as a social and cultural nation has been imagined in the minds of a thinker like M.K. Gandhi. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.